Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Jessica DeGanzik, the Vice President of Events for the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight with Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with politics professor Dan Schnur. Dan will be focusing on two primary topics today, but we will also be sharing updates about the Virginia governor's election if we get them. His first topic, will China invade Taiwan, and what would the US do? The second topic, Washington versus Facebook, the future of social media. An important part of our events, and Dan's favorite part, is receiving your questions. You can ask your questions using the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen and typing in your question in the question section. See if I can say that one more time. And we'll get to those in about 30 minutes. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dan to the webinar.
Hello, Jessica.
Hey, Dan, how are you?
Good, it's great to see you.
Great to see you as well. I'll turn this conversation over to you and join you in about 30 minutes with some questions from our audience. So thank you so much.
See you in a little while. Thank you, Jessica. Thanks very much to all of you for joining us here tonight. We do have a couple of very interesting topics, which I think you've read about. We're going to talk about China and Taiwan, as Jessica mentioned, and then also about the increasing and growing controversy surrounding Facebook. But as Jessica mentioned, tonight, of course, is election night in many places in the country. And the most notable campaign taking place, of course, is the race for the governor of the state of Virginia. And as all of you know, Virginia is one of only two states in the country that have campaigns for governor in the year after a presidential election. And so historically, the outcome in the Virginia governor's race tends to be the first report card for a new president 1 year into that president's term, and also tends to be an early sign on how the following year's midterm elections might go. So Virginia used to, for many, many years, Virginia used to be very competitive between the two parties. But Democrats have made such large gains in the suburban areas outside of Washington, D.C., that it's actually been 12 years since a Republican has been elected governor in that state. And this year, and we talked about it a couple of weeks ago on this webinar, this year we've been watching a very, very close contest between Democrat Terry McAuliffe and Republican Glenn Youngkin. And the early reports, about an hour after the polls have now closed in Virginia, is that the race is too close to call. But what is worth remembering is just last year, Joe Biden won the state of Virginia by 10 points. So a very close race, regardless of who the winner is. Either way, a close race is going to send a pretty important message to the national parties heading into next year's elections. There's other important campaigns going on around the country as well, and one in particular I'd encourage you to pay attention to is the polls are not yet closed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but in that city, where of course we saw the tragic death of George Floyd last year, in the city of Minneapolis, there's a local ballot measure, which if passed, would eliminate the Minneapolis Police Department and would replace it with the Department of Public Safety. That would be focusing more of its attention and energies on preventive measures. So two of many important campaigns around the country, and as Jessica mentioned, if we do find a final outcome, if we do hear a final outcome in Virginia between now and the end of our webinar, Jessica or Claire will let us know, and of course we'll be able to talk with you about that outcome in the last 30 minutes of the program when we shift our attention to your questions and comments. But anyway, let's get on with our scheduled topics, the first being China. And topic one, is China going to invade Taiwan? Now, the honest answer is we don't know. But here's what we do know. We know that just a few weeks ago, in early October, over China's National Day holiday, more than 80 Chinese military planes violated the airspace over Taiwan over a couple-day period. And this was even more notable because of the number and the types of planes involved. There were several different types of Chinese bombers and anti-submarine planes, planes that were deployed at night, all of which was done to send a very strong signal to Taiwan and the world that China who ever since 1949 has been talking about the importance of the reunification of their country, may be more prepared than ever to reunite Taiwan and China militarily. Now, those flights, even a very large number of them, 80 in just 2 days, even though those flights don't necessarily suggest an imminent threat of war over Taiwan, they do reflect Beijing's increasingly aggressive signaling that it does want to reclaim Taiwan, and it's not going to rule out military means to do so. Now, we also know that Taiwan security depends increasingly on the United States, which provides most of Taiwan's weapons. Now, under a 1979 law, the United States could intervene in an attempted military takeover of Taiwan, but it's not obliged to do so. And that language was constructed very carefully at the time in a stated policy known as strategic ambiguity. Because what the US was and still is concerned about is, on one hand, they don't want to look like they're walking away from Taiwan, which would simply encourage Chinese aggression. On the other hand, we don't want to do anything, the United States does not want to do anything too provocative that could alarm China by making a definitive statement of a military commitment. Now, the other thing we know, though, given that policy of strategic ambiguity, which has been in US policy for more than 40 years now, we also know that President Biden's been using much more aggressive language relating to Taiwan than we've heard previously. And just a week after those Chinese air incursions I was talking about a minute ago, Biden did say definitively that the United States was committed to coming to Taiwan's defense if it comes under attack from China, which did seem to be in opposition to the United States' stated policy of this strategic ambiguity. Now, Biden was asked during a CNN town hall that took place, like I said, about a week after the Chinese air forays over Taiwan. Biden was asked during a CNN town hall whether the US would protect Taiwan if China attacked, and Biden said very definitively that it would. And he said, I'm going to quote, he said, quote, "Yes, we have a commitment to do that." Now, Anderson Cooper was the CNN anchor, and he heard that. And he understood right away that that was a deviation, a major deviation from the US policy of strategic ambiguity. So Cooper followed up, and he said, "So, Mr. President, are you saying that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked?" And once again, Biden said, yes, quote, yes, we have a commitment to do that. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty unambiguous to me. But Secretary of State Tony Blinken and other Biden administration officials went out right away to say that the president had not changed the US policy, because of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, that would have been seen as a major provocation by the Chinese. So it sounds like it might have just been a misstatement by Biden. But it's the second time that he has answered the question in precisely that way in just the last few months. And once again, this is only 1 week after the Chinese flights into Taiwan airspace. So that's where Biden is. But what about all of you? What do you think the US position should be if China invades Taiwan? Should the US become involved? If China invades Taiwan, should the US become involved, A, militarily, B, economically, C, diplomatically, or D, not at all? Now, granted, those first three answers could overlap. Many of you might think we should do 2 or 3 of those things. But if you do think that part of the US response should be the type of military defense that Biden talked about, then you should pick letter A. And if either economic or diplomatic engagement you think is the most important component, that will be your second or third pick. And if you think it's something we ought to stay out of, then of course not at all is your answer. So Claire, how do we do? What did we get from our group? Very interesting. Only 28%, barely a quarter of our group agrees with what President Biden seems to be saying, that a military response would be warranted from the United States. 52%, more than half, say a diplomatic engagement, and only 3% say not at all, that we shouldn't do anything in the slightest. Though interesting, looks like our group is pretty much in sync with traditional US policy, not quite with where Biden has been, how Biden has been speaking more lately. Now, of course, as all of you know, Taiwan is not unique in the region in terms of vulnerability to China. Almost every country in the Pacific Rim, including Japan and South Korea, India, Vietnam, and many others, have felt pressured by China's increasingly aggressive behavior in recent years. When Biden announced the US withdrawal from Afghanistan a few months ago, he made a point of mentioning America's commitment to these countries, and specifically, once again, to Taiwan. And this is what Biden said. Once again, in the interest of precision, I'm going to quote him. Biden said, quote, "We made a sacred commitment to Article 5 that if in fact anyone were to invade or take action against our NATO allies, we would respond. Same with Japan, same with South Korea, same with Taiwan," unquote. But while we do have a treaty, a mutual defense treaty with NATO, and while we do have a mutual defense agreement with South Korea and Japan, we don't have one with Taiwan. So once again, the question is Biden being intentional or not? We're not sure, but neither is China. And that might be Biden's goal, to leave China unsure about whether he's going to engage in more forceful action or not, which he hopes would make them be more hesitant to move more aggressively against Taiwan. So let's broaden the conversation a little bit. And before we do, I want to bring all of you back into it. So Claire, if we can put up our second question. Given what we've just talked about, as it relates not just to Taiwan, but other countries in the region, how would you characterize US attitudes toward China? Option number one, we're overreacting. There's still plenty of diplomatic opportunities to pursue, and we shouldn't be doing all the saber rattling. Option number two, if anything, we're underreacting. China's demonstrated this serious threat, and we need to do more to be prepared to confront that threat if necessary. Or third, yeah, we've gotten it pretty much at the Goldilocks level, just right. We're reacting at the appropriate level of caution or concern, neither underreacting or overreacting. So which of those three options characterizes the way all of you think? Oh, wow. 58% of you think we're doing we're doing this right. But by almost a 3-to-1 margin, our group thinks that we're not taking China seriously enough, that we're underreacting. 30% to 12%, like I said, not quite, but almost 3-to-1. Our group thinks we ought to be doing more rather than less to prepare for potential confrontation. Now, all of this has led to questions about whether we've entered a new Cold War. And China has emerged as a much broader strategic adversary than the Soviet Union ever was. A technological threat, a military threat, and an economic rival. And the problem, of course, is that governments that plunge into that mindset, a Cold War mentality, if you will, can exaggerate every conflict because we're convinced that every small conflict is part of a larger struggle. And what that leads to is the potential to miss opportunities for cooperation, as the United States and China missed an opportunity for cooperation on the coronavirus, and an opportunity we appear to be missing on climate change. Now, there's plenty else going on between the two countries. In addition to China's actions near Taiwan, they're also expanding their space program. They're accelerating tests of hypersonic missiles that are designed to defeat American missile defenses. And many war game simulations, both by the Pentagon and by private think tanks, show that in a conflict over Taiwan, in fact, China could defeat the United States. Now, at the same time, the United States announced it would provide nuclear submarine technology to Australia. That's what caused the huge dust-up with France that Biden was trying to deal with when he was in Europe this past weekend. And Chinese commentators, though, as much as the focus in this country was on the US and Australia's relationship with France, when the United States announced that it would give those nuclear submarines to Australia, well, what Chinese commentators were focusing on was not whether the French's feelings were hurt. They pointed out that the last time the United States shared that type of nuclear technology was in 1958, when the British were given naval reactors as part of the effort to counter the Soviet Union's expanding nuclear arsenals. And Chinese commentators drew the parallel very directly between the US's aggression toward the Soviet Union in the 1950s and what they see as similar activities here in the 21st century. And of course, all of that doesn't even get into the continued arguments over human rights violations in Northwest China and Hong Kong, and a whole range of economic and trade disagreements, which we're overdue to discuss again in the future. So all sorts of challenges going on. Claire, can we put up the third question for our group? Which of China's actions do you find most objectionable or unsettling? I guess would be another way of looking at it. Is it economic, trade, or misconduct of the type that both Trump and Biden have talked about? Number two, are it the human rights violations that are causing such a dust-up in the lead up to the Beijing Winter Olympics next year? Is it security and military matters and the type of aggressiveness we've been talking about now in Taiwan and elsewhere in the Pacific Rim? Are we most concerned about China's actions or lack of actions on climate change and environmental issues? Or alternatively, none of the above? Do you think we're overreacting to this whole China thing? So once again, let's see what our group has to say. Very interesting. 44% of you, and I guess I might have put my thumb on the scale here because we've been talking about military and security issues for the last several minutes, but 44% of you say that security and military aggressiveness is the greatest concern. 32%, not that much less, mention human rights violations, and we really are overdue for a conversation on the Uyghurs and on Hong Kong, not just in the context of the Olympics, but more broadly. Much smaller numbers on economic issues and on climate change, and only 1% of you, only a few of you, think that this is nothing to be concerned about. So wide range of issues, lots to talk about in the weeks and months ahead. But on this whole Cold War question, before we move on to the next topic, it's important to remember that China and the US are far more economically engaged and far more economically interdependent than we ever were with the Soviet Union. The Cold War of the 20th century was almost completely a military set of rivalries. But here, because of the complex economic interrelationships between our two countries, this is a much more complicated, this is a much trickier equation. So the likelihood of military hostilities, given those economic interdependence, is probably smaller. But it's also worth remembering that China's own economic challenges and its problems with social unrest are causing their leaders a lot of problems. And authoritarian governments over history tend to rely very heavily on nationalistic sentiment and often confrontation to quiet internal dissent. But of course, if you come to think about it, democratic countries do the same thing too. Well, let's move on to our second topic. And I'd like to talk for a little bit with all of you about the controversy surrounding Facebook and the growing challenges that Facebook is finding both in the public square and in the political world. Now, as I think most of you saw, Facebook changed its name last week. Not the name of the social media platform itself, but rather of the governing company. They've now changed their name to Meta because Mark Zuckerberg announced last week that they're going to focus much more of their attention in the years ahead on constructing a virtual reality environment in which we can all work and live and occupy space. And we'll talk about what that means in a future week also. But a lot of people suspect that Zuckerberg made this big grand announcement about Facebook's new set of goals in order to distract attention from several weeks of unpleasant and very unflattering media coverage and political discussion. Now, just a couple weeks ago, when a former Facebook employee turned whistleblower by the name of Frances Haugen testified before Congress, and she laid out a series of scathing allegations against Facebook and its practices. Now, we don't have time here today to go through all of her accusations, but to sum up many of the points that she made, Haugen essentially said that Facebook's leaders, from Mark Zuckerberg on down, that Facebook's leaders were aware of the societal and political damage that their product was causing, but they ignored those problems because addressing those problems would have diminished the amount of time that their users spent on Facebook, and that would have cut into the company's earnings. So before we go any further, I'd like to ask you a question just to frame where we all are as it relates to Facebook. So just a question for all of you in terms of your own personal habits. How often do you use Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp? Do you go on Facebook once a day or more? Are you on multiple times a week? Do you go on Facebook rarely, just a few times a month? Or do you never go on Facebook? So let's get a sense of our group and how heavily we're all engaged on Facebook. And this is really interesting. This is really interesting because Facebook's data shows that over the years, since its inception, when it was primarily something used by younger people, and if we can leave the numbers up for just another minute, Claire, back in its early days, Facebook was primarily a younger person's social media platform. And studies show that as years have passed and younger people have migrated to Instagram and to Snapchat and to TikTok, Facebook has become something that's of more use to older generations. And we know from some of our previous surveys that I'm not the only old person in this conversation. And so for those of us who are Gen Xers or baby boomers, statistics would show, you'd think, that more of us did use Facebook. But 44%, almost half, said that they never go on the social media platform. 20%, 1 out of 5, are on once a day or more. 22%, also about a fifth, are on regularly, many times a week. And 14% just occasionally. So we've got a pretty good range here, almost an even split between those who are on frequently and those who are on never. So knowing that, let's dig into the conversation, whether you happen to be a Facebook user or not. You'll see as we go forward in this conversation how the way Facebook operates affects all of us, regardless of whether we happen to use their product or not. Because here's what Haugen said. She said the algorithms that Facebook uses, in other words, the computer formulas that determine what shows up on a user's feed, on a user's screen, that those algorithms were intentionally set up to prioritize content that was confrontational or negative or inflammatory. Now, those decisions weren't made because the people who run Facebook are mean or sadistic. Those decisions were based on their knowledge of human nature. We know that human beings tend to pay more attention to information that appeals to our baser instincts. Facebook, like many social media companies, wants to keep their users on their sites for as long as possible. And the way to do that, the way to keep people on their website, is by providing content that's more provocative, more combative, and often nastier and more accusatory. So blame these companies for what they do, but know that they're capitalizing on what we do. And our natural human instinct is to gravitate toward information and content that is more confrontational and is more combative. So in any case, the Facebook algorithm rewards posts that provoke the most extreme reactions, often anger or rage or fear, because the product was designed, as I said, to keep users on the platform for as long as possible, no matter how it makes them feel or what it makes them think. And we're just beginning to understand the way that affects our politics, the increased polarization and the suspicion and the hyper-partisanship on both sides of the aisle, because we're all on both sides, we're being fed news and information that's designed to increase our dislike and our disdain for those people on the other side. But it turns out that for all the focus on the impact of Facebook on politics, the most important aspect of Haugen's testimony wasn't about political accusations or fake news, but rather about the impact that Facebook's algorithms have on young people, especially children. And in particular, there was a study about how Instagram's photos caused large increases in teenage anorexia and other eating disorders and other body imaging problems, and how even younger children were impacted by the steady diet of inflammatory or unpleasant postings. Now, Haugen said that Facebook's amplification algorithms and what they call engagement-based ranking, which is the part of the algorithm that rewards posts that gets the most likes, the most shares, and the most follows, that these algorithms were driving children and teenagers to destructive online content. And that's what was leading to the body image issues, to mental health crises, to bullying, and other pathologies. She said that Facebook was, and I quote, buying its profits with our safety, unquote. And Haugen alleges that Facebook knew that its algorithm was funneling teens toward harmful content, but it refused to take steps to stop it. And that it's expanded the team on which she had worked, which was designed to monitor these problems, called the so-called civic integrity team, that they disbanded the civic integrity team shortly after the election. And that's part of what allowed the extremism to flourish on the platform in the weeks and days leading up to January 6th. Now, until Haugen's testimony a couple weeks ago, most of the conversation about regulating Facebook is focused on politics, on hate speech, on disinformation, and on the platform's role in enabling the January 6th Capitol riot. And that's a conversation that inflames tensions on both sides of the aisle and has led to political impasse in Congress about how to handle Facebook. But the congressional committee members who are listening to Haugen seemed especially impacted by her testimony about Facebook's potential to hurt kids, which could give Congress a way to move forward in regulating Facebook without getting caught up in the usual political back and forth of censorship and free speech. Now, White House officials know that the momentum generated by Haugen's testimony is going to fade over time, and that the window of popular support for major structural changes to social media is going to close. Now, Biden's key focus is he wants Congress to strengthen antitrust laws. He wants to make sure that privacy is better protected, and he wants to rewrite what's known as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is a law that's designed to make, if it were rewritten, would make tech companies more accountable for illegal happenings on their platforms. The White House is also looking at the Child Online Protection Act, which is a current existing law, to see if there's something the administration can do to make sure platforms are complying with provisions that are supposed to prevent harming children. But antitrust, either through legislation or a more aggressive federal trade commission, or both, is Biden's highest priority. And an increasing number of voices in both the Democratic and the Republican Party are saying that just like the railroads and just like the oil companies and just like the telecom companies some years ago, that maybe Facebook is too big and needs to be broken up. So question for all of you, and we'll get to your questions in just a couple minutes, but before we do, I want to ask you what you think about this. Do you think Facebook should be broken up into smaller companies? Yes, because they are too big and too powerful, and they're able to unilaterally impose these kind of effects on us. Or no, there are less drastic measures that can be taken than if the government come in and actually break up the company. So let's see what we got from our group. Look at that. 70%, more than 2/3, almost 3/4 of you agree with both Democrat Elizabeth Warren and Republican Josh Hawley, a very progressive Democrat and a very conservative Republican, that Facebook ought to be broken up. 30% say that might be a little bit too drastic. I know we're at the bottom of the hour, but there's a couple more points I wanted to make before we go to your questions, because I think this really is an important issue, not just politically, but societally. Well, Haugen speaking out about Facebook is especially important on two fronts for two reasons. The first is intentionality. Facebook has been presenting themselves for years as a company that recognizes these societal problems, that exhibits concern about these problems, and has been looking for ways to address them. But Haugen says from the inside, she says they knew exactly what they were doing and they refused to act because they wanted to keep users on their platform. The other reason her testimony is so important, going back to a point I made earlier, is the focus on young people. Haugen effectively depoliticized the conversation. She made it less about right-wing extremism and more about kids' mental health. And it sidestepped the major partisan disagreement about the dangers of social media. Republicans are most concerned about Facebook's purported attacks on free speech. Democrats are much angrier about Facebook's role in spreading hate speech and disinformation online. So even though both sides are mad at Facebook, they're mad for different reasons. And that's what's kept legislation from passing. Focusing on the potential harm to children puts the blame back on the platform itself rather than on the bad actors using it. And that does leave a window of opportunity to address these issues. But whether it's antitrust, whether it's children's protection, whether it's other types of remedies that the Biden administration is weighing, it's going to be a very long and difficult fight. So we're a couple minutes over, but Jessica, let's, if you can, why don't you come back and join us, and then we'll bring in the rest of our group for questions and comments and discussion. What do you think?
Sounds good. And I've been back here refreshing all of the election results pages, trying to see, and nothing has been called yet. But Claire is also on the back end now checking all that information, so she might chime in if the elections are called. So let's hop into these questions. I know it's somewhat south of Taiwan, but how do you think this calculus also plays out in the South China Sea? China has been quite aggressive in expanding its territorial claims there and has been creating islands to bolster those claims. What is the U.S. position there?
So the U.S. position for the South China Sea is actually somewhat similar to Taiwan in this strategic ambiguity. We haven't said, the U.S. has never said that we will engage militarily if China behaves in certain ways in that region. But it's let China and the world know that it reserves the right to engage militarily. So as a result, we send aircraft carriers through the South China Sea to sending a warning to China about not being too aggressive. We've deployed military to the region, not for combat, but for training purposes. So unlike South Korea or Japan or NATO, there's no formal commitment. But like Taiwan, the US recognizes the potential threat that China poses. They do recognize the increased aggression on China's part and do spend a great deal of time trying to shore up regional alliances. So if there does become a more direct confrontation, it's not just the United States on one hand and China on the other, but rather a regional alliance of the US and its allies standing together.
The U.S. do anything to transfer its or Taiwan's chip technology and manufacturing to the USA or somewhere safer from China?
So this is a critical issue, and there wasn't time to get into it in the first half an hour, so I'm glad the questioner raised it. As most of you know, one of the reasons that we're facing such product shortages in this country, particularly of automobiles, but of computers and of smartphones also, isn't just the problems at the ports, but also is an immense, very, very serious shortage in semiconductors. And these are the chips that we need for our cars, for our phones, for our computers, and without them, the production and therefore the sales have slowed down considerably. Now, as it happens, Taiwan is one of the world's foremost manufacturer of these chips. And because, as the questioner noted, Taiwan itself is in some danger to China because of its geographic proximity, its chip production capacity is in some danger also. And so one of the things that the US is doing right now, even while our country continues to provide more military support to Taiwan, there's been confirmed reports of US military personnel now stationed on the island of Taiwan. Again, not in combat roles, but in training capacity also, which is enough for China to take in itself as a provocation. But even at the same time, they're working to shore up Taiwan militarily. They are looking for ways to safeguard this chip production, either by moving it off the island of Taiwan, which the Taiwanese leadership is not particularly thrilled about, or finding other ways to safeguard it and expand it, so that in addition to Taiwan being potentially a protector of the United States, can also be an added benefit, a more considerable resource of the kind of technology that we're struggling to identify on our own. So I did present the Taiwan question primarily in the context of a military challenge, but the questioner is right to raise it. Taiwan's chip producing capacity has immense economic benefits for the United States. And the best way to foster and expand those technologies is not only in Taiwan's best interests, but in our country's also.
Thank you. And this is a bit of a follow-up to that question. Other than semiconductors, does today's Congress feel obliged to support Taiwan if there were to be an invasion?
That's a good question, and we don't know the answer to that. Congress, like administrations, both Republican and Democrat over the years, tend to have maintained a level of ambiguity on the subject. Some members of Congress, now and for many years, have made it very clear in much more stark terms that if China were to act militarily against Taiwan, that the US would engage militarily as well. Others have said that the US will not engage whatsoever. But the swing middle in Congress, like the Biden and the Trump and the Obama administrations and those that preceded it, are somewhat more ambiguous about it. And the general sentiment among those swing votes in Congress is, we reserve the right to engage militarily. They want the Chinese to be concerned about the prospect of direct US military engagement, but recognize that absolutely guaranteeing it could be seen as an overly combative stance to take in a pretty tricky relationship. But once again, going back to what we talked about in the first half an hour, that's why Biden's statements over the last few months have been so instructive. Biden isn't being ambiguous about this. He's being much more straightforward. And even while White House staff and the State Department have walked back Biden's comments and said the US has not changed policy, the Chinese are very aware that when the President of the United States and the country's commander-in-chief does say something more starkly, more than once, it's entirely likely that he means it. And that has the potential, from Biden's perspective, to potentially be unsettling to the Chinese without overly provoking them. So it's a very, very fine line to walk, and on balance, Congress is in the same place on this that most modern administrations, presidential administrations, have been.
How much did Biden's disastrous performance during the Afghanistan withdrawal embolden China?
The more time that passes from the Afghanistan withdrawal, the more damage we see of that. On one hand, we now see China getting more involved in Afghanistan and working with the Taliban very closely on a number of fronts. But in terms of China as activity in its own neighborhood, there's great concern that the Chinese believe that the US, just like they walked away from Afghanistan, might decide to walk away from Taiwan or Japan or South Korea, because just as our country demonstrated that we did not just the president, public opinion in this country demonstrated that we no longer had the appetite to continue a military engagement in Afghanistan, a number of Chinese leaders are wondering if we will come to the same conclusion about prolonged engagement on the Pacific Rim. Not only China, but Russia, Iran, and other bad actors around the world are openly asking the same question. That's why Biden made such a point of saying that he would honor our mutual defense agreement with NATO and with Japan and with South Korea. And then again, for emphasis sake, he added Taiwan, even though such an agreement didn't exist. But it's very clear that not only did China and Russia see the US withdrawal from Afghanistan as raising questions about our commitment and allegiances in other parts of the world, but it's just as clear that Biden himself sees a need to push back against that growing suspicion.
Thank you. Should US-based corporations with strong corporate social responsibility programs discontinue doing business with China, who has disregard for human rights and rules-based international order?
Well, an increasing number of US businesses are doing just that, either because of human rights violations with the Uyghurs or in Hong Kong, or because of concerns about their ability to run their own businesses and whether they'll be vulnerable to a rule of law that doesn't seem nearly as solid as it might have 5, 6, 10 years ago. Some of you may have seen that Yahoo just announced that it's pulling out of China. And it doesn't appear that that's because of its concern about human rights violations in this country, but rather it's simply its ability to do business. And as China becomes more and more aggressive, both on the human rights and on the security fronts, you'll almost certainly see more US businesses making the same decision. On the other hand, as all of you know, China is such an immense market for US products that it's very difficult for companies to pull out. This is something we're seeing in particular in Silicon Valley. It's something we're seeing in the entertainment industry in Hollywood. It's even something that we're seeing in US professional sports leagues, but more conventional US business sectors, manufacturing and so on, recognize that not being able to sell to China creates a real obstacle to their overall bottom line. And so while more companies are pulling out, either because of their own ability to do business or because of concerns about human rights or military aggression, a much, much larger number are going to continue to stay as long as they're allowed to, simply because of the economic opportunities. Remember, I mentioned that the big difference between this landscape and the US-Soviet Union Cold War of the 20th century is that there was no real economic interdependence between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1950s to the 1980s. Because the economic situation is so much more complicated, it is going to be much more difficult for the two countries to extricate. And so even as human rights violations worsen in China, which I suspect they will, you'll still see a pretty formidable cohort of China-based US companies that will continue to do business there.
Is Biden's rhetoric versus China politically wise, or is it ramping up a dangerous Cold War and possibly more? Do European allies agree with Biden's view?
So two good questions. On the second question, our European allies are very much split on whether or on how to react to China. Some Western European countries and most of Eastern Europe share the United States' suspicions and concerns about China and have agreed to work with the US much more closely to present a united front. But there are countries in Western Europe which currently enjoy fairly beneficial economic relationships with China, and they've been much less eager to sign on to a more confrontational approach from the United States. This is a topic that's been discussed at the last of the two G7 meetings. It got less attention this last weekend because climate change was the primary topic of discussion. But back when the G7 first met during Biden's administration back in May. Biden's primary goal in that conversation was in order to get the world's other leading economies to stand with him to push back against China. And there was a real split on whether that was a good idea or not. So Biden is certainly putting much more time and effort into building these relationships in order to stand in a more united way against China and Russia, should it be necessary. But while he's made some progress, there are certainly holdouts, a number of holdouts, and much more when it comes to China than to Russia because of the potential economic opportunities. On the first question, is Biden being too confrontational? I don't think so, but I'll admit that I don't know. We'll learn more. I don't think anybody knows for sure, and we'll learn more in the months and years going forward. I will say this, that for most of the last several decades, there's been a bipartisan consensus in Washington, under Democratic and Republicans both, that additional, further, broader economic engagement with China would encourage them to begin to behave more appropriately in terms of democracy and human rights. And what we've learned over the last few years, perhaps the Trump administration's most important contribution to the world geopolitical landscape, is it's become increasingly clear that economic engagement does not lead to increased democracy and human rights in China. In fact, it's emboldened them to move just in the opposite direction. So what you're seeing from Biden now, and I suspect you'll see from Biden's successor, whether that individual is a Democrat or Republican, is a much less open-armed approach to China, primarily because of our newfound understanding that building economic ties does not coax China into the world of nations on democratic and human rights questions too.
Thank you. Why not recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation, grant it membership in the UN, and then defend its sovereignty, similar to how the world handled the breakup of Yugoslavia?
Well, it's entirely possible. And there's an argument that if the US were to act that forcefully, that China would not want to call the United States bluff and would simply mutter angry thoughts and essentially give up, for all practical purposes, give up on Taiwan. But those kind of official actions could also cause China to react more forcefully also. And if they're already flying these kind of sorties over Taiwan, if they're already talking about potential military action, there is some concern among the nation, not only among our nation's diplomats, but among our nation's military leaders, that if we move too forcefully in that direction, it will encourage China to react even more aggressively than they might otherwise. More and more of the experts in this field are beginning to believe that China will act aggressively regardless of what the United States does, which supports the questioner's argument that if China is going to take those kind of measures at some point anyway, why not stand firm in advance of it? But at least for now, the majority of our nation's military and diplomatic experts think that standing with Taiwan is a good thing to discourage China, but standing with them as forcefully as the questioner suggested could have a counter effect. I don't pretend to know which argument is better, but I will note before we go on to the next question that China recognizes that at this point it has a pronounced military advantage over Taiwan. China also knows that Taiwan is moving as quickly as it possibly can to increase its military capacity with the US's help. And so China therefore logically knows that the longer they wait, the less pronounced an advantage they would have should a military conflict take place in that area. That sounds to me like an incentive for them to act more quickly. I hope I'm wrong. And what the US is trying to accomplish by sending troops there for training is to let the Chinese know that even if the military capability gap is closing, that the presence of US military personnel on the island should preclude the Chinese from acting more aggressively. Long-winded way of saying, we just don't know.
Do you have any resources you recommend for people to read that focus on social media impacting the general public's health?
Boy, the, there's been a really good amount um, of helpful mainstream media coverage on this issue. I've seen more in the nation's leading newspapers and periodicals on this over the last couple months than I ever have in the past. And I would say that in particular, the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and Time Magazine of the legacy media organizations probably do the best job of covering these questions. But I'd also encourage you to look into online media platforms that specialize in covering digital media. And so online publications such as Vice and Vox really do devote a considerable amount of time and effort to this. But I would say for those of you who, like me, still tend to rely, maybe not completely, but most heavily on legacy media, the Wall Street Journal clearly had the lead in most aggressively taking on the Facebook story early on. And I think their coverage has been the most reliable. But in addition to them, both the Times and Time also do very good work on this. But I would also encourage you to seek out online publications as well. And Vice and Vox are a couple of them. I'd recommend Axios, AXIOS, for doing very good coverage in this area, particularly the way that online media's political and cultural impacts overlap. But for those of you who are more comfortable in the world of traditional media, the Journal and the Times are probably the two most impressive standouts.
Thank you. I was going to add to there, Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, did a really interesting book a few years ago. I think it's the coddling of the American mind, how good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. And he talks a lot about the social media impact and girls, doing self-harm and things like that. So I found that to be a good book on this topic as well, but it's a couple of years old.
It's excellent. And in addition to his book, he's written several long articles about this. The other publication I should have mentioned is The Atlantic, which has done much longer form pieces, of course, than the Times or the Journal can, and they've done some very impressive work on this. But Haidt, whether it's his books, his articles, or even YouTube videos, is something worth paying serious attention to, Jessica. I'm glad you raised it.
Yeah, no problem. I'm worried about this for our youth for many reasons. Could a remedy to address Meta that is solely focused on children's health or trust busting seriously address the underlying issue, the human behavior rewards this commercial strategy, or prevent other / resulting companies from copying it?
Well, as I said earlier, this is human nature. And this is something that's not just cultural. It's almost chemical in us. It goes back to prehistoric eras where we are hardwired trying to survive as bands of hunters and gatherers. We are hardwired to be more attuned to threats than to opportunities. And that same dynamic works verbally, either in writing or speaking. We're simply going to be more reactive to provocative and combative and confrontational content. There were studies done during the 2016 and 2020 elections, to put this in a political context, that showed that online social media users were twice as likely to engage with a like or a retweet or a share, twice as likely to engage with material that referenced the opposing candidate than your own. In other words, you're not that motivated to share information or encourage your friends to read information that say good things about your own candidate, much more motivated to share and to like that information as it relates to the opponent. This is the argument that Ezra Klein makes about so-called negative partisanship, how in an era of social media, more and more of us align with the political party, not because of our belief in our party's goals, but because of our shared distaste and disgust for the opposing party and its candidates and its ideas. So it is human nature, but that doesn't mean that it's completely unavoidable in a social media context. I would encourage you, I mentioned what a good job the Wall Street Journal did in its early coverage, The Washington Post also did an excellent series on how Facebook has been operating over these years. And one point that both newspapers made, and that Haugen herself made very emphatically in her testimony, is that when Facebook added different ways to react to certain pieces of news and information, in addition to just liking it, one of its additional emotional options, the ability to express anger toward a particular posting or piece of information, was weighted 5 times more heavily than the like. So Jessica, if you read something that you liked, it got 1 little check in the algorithm. But if you use that anger response, it got 5 checks. And what that means from a practical standpoint is when you display anger toward information that's presented to you on Facebook, it's going to be 5 times more likely to be seen by all of your friends than something that you liked. And as Haugen correctly pointed out, it wouldn't take that much to readjust that balance. And Facebook has, to their credit, they've moved in that direction. They haven't completed the balancing act yet, but they've moved away from such a horrible imbalance. But the incentive, as I was talking about earlier, is that the anger and the animosity draws people's interest. And that means it keeps people on the site that much longer.
That's awful. We shouldn't be giving more points to angry. I like more laughter. I'll try to laugh at things more.
Well, so human nature, human nature is at the core of this, which means we all share some responsibility. But Haugen's argument is that Facebook and other social media companies as well go out of their way to highlight those natural tendencies.
Awful. Do you think that McAuliffe has hurt himself and the Democratic Party by arguing that the Dems are not giving him anything to run on, when he could have been talking about the rescue plan, the Senate passed infrastructure plan, and that the Build Back Better is being completed all for the working class?
Well, it's a good question to ask me in a few hours or maybe tomorrow morning, because if McAuliffe loses, then I think that is a fair criticism. Because Terry McAuliffe, the Democratic candidate for governor of Virginia, has been criticizing the Democrats in Congress for not moving forward more quickly with Biden's legislative package, he's been attempting to separate himself from the voter disgust for that lack of action. And we've seen not just in Virginia, but nationally, that a lot of loyal Democrats are very disappointed in their party. So McAuliffe understandably wanted to distance himself from the source of that dissatisfaction. If he loses, that means it was a mistake. And he demotivated his own base in Virginia even further. On the other hand, if he does pull off the win, even in a much closer race than Virginia Democrats have seen in recent years, then it'll be reasonable to look back at the campaign and assume that because he mirrored and he reflected so many voters' dissatisfaction with the lack of progress in Washington, that may have saved him. McAuliffe's greatest challenge going into tonight was not persuading swing voters, but a base of Democratic voters, young people, voters from minority communities, and other progressives who weren't going to vote for the Republican Youngkin under any circumstances, but who simply weren't going to vote. And what we won't know until all the votes are counted is whether McAuliffe's criticism of other Democrats is something that's going to have helped motivate an unhappy base or something that discouraged him even further. So ask me again this time tomorrow.
Sounds good. Probably just our final question. Does it look like the Glasgow climate convergence will be a bust?
It's beginning to look like it. It's beginning to look like there will be some progress made in Glasgow. But if you look at the sentiments being voiced by Boris Johnson, being voiced by Prince Charles, and by Pope Francis, it's pretty clear that while the leaders of the world's largest countries are talking in a somewhat compelling way about the progress they've made, that there are enough people pointing out how short they came of necessary goals to look back. Well, actually, I'll give you a better example. John Kerry, who of course is President Biden's special envoy on climate change, has begun talking about how Glasgow is just one step in a longer process. And when you hear a politician saying something like that, which is don't focus so much on this one conference, it's just one step toward bigger and broader goals, that's a very polite and diplomatic way of that politician saying, we didn't get everything we hoped to here. And so while the summit is still several days from ending, the fact that we're not just hearing such critical language from the likes of Johnson and Prince Charles and Pope Francis, but the fact that we're hearing such such uninspired language from such a committed advocate as Kerry, all brings us to a conclusion that while important progress has been made, it's not nearly as much progress as many of the participants might have originally hoped.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, and thank you to our audience for all of your great questions. Just a reminder that for our members, we host an after the webinar session with Dan every other week where you're able to ask him your questions directly. So if you'd like to learn about joining these events and becoming a member, please contact our office. Also, if you'd like to support the council and programs like these and to learn about our upcoming events and membership, please visit our website at lawacth.org. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dan, and thank you to those who joined us and also those who are catching us on the replay on our YouTube channel. We look forward to seeing you for our next event. Take care.
Thanks so much, everybody.